This is basically our government saying, we don't think you should be able to choose the candidate that you want to vote for unless it's someone we approve of. And like, that is not democracy.
Knowing that the same damn thing happened in Brazil at the same damn time seems too much of a coincidence. I'm Stephanie Keith.
And I am Tara Manjekovic, and we are unapologetically outspoken.
Hey everyone, and happy Wednesday. So Tara, I am excited to announce good news for once, and it has to do with Trump. So the Supreme Court just ruled 9-0 that Colorado must include Trump on the ballot. And what they put in the ruling was that states can disqualify someone from holding state office, but can't enforce Section 3 with respect to federal officials, which I think makes perfect sense. And everyone pretty much knew that they would knock down Colorado's attempt to destroy democracy. But I was really surprised that even the most liberal judges voted in favor of Trump. And I think it's just more evidence to support the fact that the real threat to democracy is these extreme leftists. And I think this is going to have a really big impact because you have Illinois and Maine that are also trying to remove him from the ballot, and then a bunch of other states that were discussing it as well. And here's the thing. If Trump is such a bad guy and they don't think he should be president, shouldn't they allow voters to decide that instead of the select few that are in power already? Like, isn't that the whole point of democracy, to let the people choose? And the whole thing, it's like, I want to be happy for him because this is a win, but I also know that this is the first of many shady tactics that the Democrats are going to use between now and the election because they know the left is losing. And already the left media is talking about like how this is an outrage and they need to get really mad and really scared and really fearful of Trump. So you know that there's just going to be more BS coming. But I think that the vast majority of people are waking up and aren't buying any of this bullshit any longer. And I want to play this clip of an incredible speech that Ben Carson gave. So listen to this.
Just a few miles up the road in Washington, D.C., an entirely different scene is unfolding. Our government and our legacy institutions are losing credibility in the public eye at breakneck speed, even though their systematic takeover of America has been going on for years. The federal bureaucracy, the mainstream media, academia, Hollywood, big tech, and every other nexus of power in America today has turned its fire against conservatives, against Christians, against anyone who stands in their way. I call this the crisis of legitimacy in the United States government. America was founded on the notion that all political power comes from the consent of the governed, and that sovereignty does not belong to any one official or institution, but it belongs to we, the American people. The reality is that the government in Washington, D.C. no longer represents the people it claims to serve. And it has stopped even pretending to execute the charge laid out by our founders, the protection of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Put simply, Washington is losing its legitimate claim to govern the American people. Millions of Americans look around and wonder, what's becoming of their beloved nation? They don't recognize the place that they grew up in, and they wonder what kind of future is in store for their children and grandchildren. Young men, particularly young white men, aren't signing up in great numbers for military anymore because they don't want to fight for a country that hates them. They don't want to die halfway around the world to protect the borders of Ukraine or Taiwan or any other country on the earth when our own border is being overrun by the millions with terrorists and cartel members and human traffickers coming in every day. They don't want to join a fighting force that is more concerned with woke activism, gender inclusivity, LGBT issues, than it is with protecting Americans. They don't want to be part of an operation that spends trillions of dollars abroad while the small towns they call home are falling into dissolution.
I love that man. I think
I
he's
do
just
too.
so like even keeled. And it's like we hear this a lot because everyone, so many people feel that way. But when it comes from him, I just feel like it hits differently because he's just not the type that usually gets riled up about anything. And man, the left, they do not like him. They do not like when there is a black man that they can't control that opposes their opinions. And so good for him for speaking up. And I just thought he said that so eloquently.
Yeah, he always does. I love him, and I had not heard that speech before, so that's awesome. And I do agree that like people are waking up, but to his point, I think a lot of people do kind of feel helpless because we're up against a justice system that isn't a justice system anymore. Like if you take Trump, he beats one case, then another one comes up and another one and another one. And it's like the left, as we know, will do anything to keep Trump not only from winning the election, but from even being eligible to run. So like if you look at this Supreme Court ruling, yeah, it's a win, but all this means is that Congress is going to try that much harder to keep him off the ballot. And this ruling essentially just established that, okay, states don't have the power because it's a federal position, but Congress has the power to make a change. And so immediately after this decision came down, instead of, focusing on the fucking border, the liberals in Congress are now focused on how can we keep Trump out of the race. So there's a movement that's being led by Democrat Jamie Raskin, chair of the Oversight Committee, who's trying to revive legislation that was proposed a couple of years ago to set up a process to determine that anyone who commits an insurrection or is involved with an insurrection is disqualified by Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And I was reading about this in the Daily Mail, and it's related to a bill that was introduced back in 2022 by Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who's a Democratic rep from Florida. And the whole goal of this bill was to allow the DOJ to sue in order to keep candidates off the ballot if they have any involvement in engaging in an insurrection. So I highly doubt this, resurrection of this bill is going to pass in Congress because, as we see every day, the parties are too divided. They can't even agree on a fucking budget. But my point in saying this is like, this is such a fuck you to the American people. This is basically our government saying, we don't think you should be able to choose the candidate that you want to vote for unless it's someone we approve of. And like, that is not democracy. And I still stand by what I always say, that we are not a democracy to begin with. But this is not freedom of choice. This is not what our electoral system was designed for. This is essentially totalitarianism in the guise of like fucking pretend democracy.
Yeah. I mean, it's so ridiculous because it's constantly the people that talk about Trump being the threat to democracy that are destroying democracy with their actions. And I can't stand Raskin, but you know what? When the Democrats had the majority and they had their whole January 6th committee, they never charged Trump with insurrection. Like, it's not an insurrection. They can say it all they want and they can keep calling it that. And the reason they're doing that is because they know that if they say it enough times, people are going to believe it. It's classical conditioning. They do it with everything. But there's no legal standing behind it. And so they're just going to keep going to the media and saying all this bullshit, just like with all the indictments. Oh, we'll just keep indicting him and keep talking about it. And eventually people will hear it so much that they'll just assume that Trump is some type of criminal felon. And that's what they do. And so luckily, I think there's people that are waking up to the nonsense and not watching the mainstream media anymore and using their brain instead of just being zombies listening to whatever the latest, hot button word is. So I want to play, this is super short, but I just want to play a little message that Trump has for Biden after the Supreme Court ruling.
President, number one, stop weaponization. Fight your fight yourself. Don't use prosecutors and judges to go after your opponent, to try and damage your opponent so you can win an election. Our country is much bigger than that.
Like, play fair and square, right? It's
Yeah.
like, and I think most people like that. Nobody likes a cheater. It's like, just play the game, like stand on your own merit, right? Like, you don't need to send a bunch of bullies to take down Trump. And do you
But
notice?
if they did, they would lose.
Yeah, well, and every time they go after him, he gets stronger and people
Mhm.
want to support him more. So it's like totally working against them, but they're not learning their lesson and they keep doing the same damn thing. And do you notice? I know we've talked about this before, but I keep noticing it more and more how Trump is just so much more like calm. And I think he's
Yes.
appealing to a wider range of people when he talks rather than like his typical rant. But I love how he still does this when he's talking. Biden, with his hands. Cracks me up.
I hope he has a better team of advisors now than he did before.
Yeah. Well, and I love his attorney that's basically like his PR spokeswoman.
Yeah.
She is like, I just think that every time she talks, it's like mic drop. Like, she just has so many good points. And hopefully, I mean, it sounds like she's probably advising him on that kind of stuff too. But talking about all of this, I have to bring up the Tucker Carlson interview from a few days ago. And this is where he interviewed Eduardo Bolsonaro, who's a senator in Brazil, and he's son of the former president that lost to Lula in the last election. And this episode left my jaw on the floor, as Tucker's interviews usually do. But I think that this particular interview was so shocking because of how similar Brazil's last election was to our last election here in the US. And just as Trump claims the election was stolen here, a lot of people believe that the election was stolen in Brazil. And just like we had January 6th here, they had the same thing where the media and the regime said that it was an attempted coup. And now everyone that was involved is in prison. And in addition, the former president is banned from seeking office for 8 years. And just like Trump, thousands of protesters have gathered peacefully at Bolsonaro's rallies to protest the ban and support him. And so I want to play a clip of his son in this interview with Tucker.
You can have any opinion you want about an election because you're a citizen, right?
Now in Brazil, they consider it's a crime.
So it would be a crime for you to say, yes, I think the election was stolen.
Yes, I could suffer a lot down there in Brazil if I come back.
Even though we know for a fact the CIA was tampering in the democratic process in Brazil, was playing a role in the election.
Yes. And one of the things why my father got ineligible in a record time right after Lula take office is because he had a meeting.
He was told he could never run again.
We are trying to overturn it inside of the courts, but as you can imagine, it will be very hard to do that. I still have a hope. But anyway, he was turned ineligible because he had a meeting with ambassadors and talked with them about the electoral system in Brazil, how it works, and criticized some points. Normal thing. But before of this meeting of Bolsonaro and the ambassadors, the president of the Superior Electoral Court, he had the same meetings with these ambassadors.
Wait, so you're saying that your father, who's often been compared to Trump, has been declared ineligible to run again in the next election on the basis of complaints about the electoral system, and that you had a protest against a rigged election that was backed by the U.S. government, and that as a result of that, Lula's political opponents wound up in jail. I mean, this sounds like exactly what's happening in the United States.
Yes.
So yeah, like literally the same timeline as the US. And it's funny because just like he said, the other thing that happened was Lula's political opponents were jailed, kind of like how the Biden regime charged Trump 19 times. And you want to know a fun little fact? Did you know Charles Manson was only charged on 10 counts, yet Trump gets 19? Like, that just goes to show how freaking ridiculous this whole thing is. So Bolsonaro explaining that the issue with the election is that the entire thing is electronic now in Brazil. So there's no paper trail whatsoever, which means if you do have an issue or a question or you want a recount, you can't. There's no way to do it. You just have to trust the electronic system. But if you bring this up as an issue, they censor you the first time. The next time you bring up this as an issue, they send the FBI to your house and freeze your accounts. And the government's reasoning behind this is that questioning the election is, guess what, Tara? A threat to democracy. The same
Shocking.
damn wording they use here. And it's funny how, like, the same terminology is used, the same events happened, the same agenda, the same election, like everything matches up perfectly. And it's no surprise that our government, like Tucker said, was involved in this election. And I didn't realize till Tucker said that, like, absolutely, like the CIA was involved and that we know about this and there's like evidence against this. Apparently, I didn't realize that. And for everyone that hates Trump, what happens next time when they do this to the candidate that you like? Or what happens when they do this to you? Like, this is dangerous. This is the real threat to democracy, because once again, this regime is setting up a precedent that we haven't seen before that could completely destroy everything that this country stands for. And I think that this is evidence that seeing what's happening in Brazil and how it lines up with the US is evidence of this global elitist regime that's seeking total power and control. Don't you think? Like, I don't think this is a conspiracy anymore. This is clear evidence of that.
Oh, definitely. And like when I first heard the interview, I'm not going to lie, I was a little terrified because, like you said, the situation that occurred in Brazil is like a fucking mirror of what's happening in the United States. And I remember at the time when the election was going on, I read a few articles, but we didn't really get much information because they censored everything. And it's like, there is no actual democracy right now in Brazil. This election was not a democratic election, it was a coup. And like they said in that interview clip you played, Lula was basically put in place with the help of China and the United States through our CIA. And if we allow our government to gain that kind of unilateral power in the next election, like, we are so fucked. And like, as a side note, I love Tucker. I've always liked Tucker, but his podcast is so much better than his segments on Fox were. And he's been doing some really incredible and eye-opening interviews lately. Not just this one. He did an interview with Xi Jinping. It's a Chinese author. She escaped from communism in China under Mao. She wrote a book about how the same Marxist cultural change is happening here in America, and she's totally right. So listening to this interview and her interview, like, you put it all together and it's really disturbing because this is what's happening in America. And despite the fact that, people are waking up to it, like, the question is it too late? And then on a weird conspiracy side note, when you were talking, when you mentioned like the entire election in Brazil was electronic, I was thinking like, okay, this would really be the perfect time to take down the power grid, because I keep thinking like they're going to do something a couple months before the election, because we already know there's going to be riots this summer. There's going to be a whole bunch of chaos. But like, how convenient would it be to kind of like lull the people into this sense of false security by letting them vote? And then it's like, oops, sorry, all the votes were lost when our power grid was sabotaged by an EMP attack, or, oh, we were attacked by China with a computer virus. But hey, we have these mail-in ballots. So in the name of, quote, democracy, we're going to count the mail-in ballots. And then like, oh, wow, look, they're like all for Biden or Michelle Obama or whomever the global elites choose to put in power. And then they can like easily just steal the election again.
Yeah. Well, and like you mentioned on a previous episode, how this is like the biggest year in the world for elections. I forget how many you said there were, but there were multiple countries where it's going to change the game. And so what scared me about this episode is hearing that our CIA and Biden, quite frankly, were pushing Lula and they were supposedly behind this election in Brazil. It makes me wonder how many of these other countries that are up for election are going to be interfered with and our CIA has got their claws in them. You know, it really makes you think. I sent this episode to my mom and her response was, thanks, I'm hyperventilating now. And I'm like, I know, it's like, it's jaw dropping, but I agree. Tucker, like, I feel like we've seen a whole new side of Tucker now that he's free from Fox. And the thing that I love about him is a lot of people just assume that he's this like hardcore Republican, which I think he used to be. He's not. Like he's just as pissed, maybe even more pissed at the Republicans as he is the Democrats because he sees this globalist uniparty. So I just had to throw that out there because he's amazing. So anyhow, I have been hesitant to talk about the alleged stolen election. I still feel like I have to say that. Like we've been so programmed to think like, oh my God, you're going to say something and then they're going to come after you. But it's true. Like I have been hesitant to talk about what happened in 2020 because we've all seen what happens to people that speak out about it. Like they censor you, just like in Brazil. The next thing they do, they arrest some people. You end up on an FBI list and people try to make you sound like a MAGA lunatic. But now that, I'm seeing very clearly that the same thing is happening in Brazil and our government's behind it. I feel like it's time to discuss the topic. And what we have heard repeated over and over again by the media and the Biden regime is that there is zero evidence of election interference in the Trump-Biden 2020 election. And despite the fact that you had Hillary Clinton and the Democrats that cried about Trump stealing the 2016 election, and that's all they talked about for 4 years. And then you look at like how many people in the past have questioned election results on both sides of the aisle. We're not allowed to even mention the 2020 election now. So that should say a lot about where we're at as a country. Literally, you cannot mention it without getting censored, or at the very least, they slap a warning label on it. And I'm sure you've seen, Tara, on our TikTok, any of these clips that I share, like of Tucker or of Trump, there's a label on it, a warning label. Yep. It's insane.
That's if we can actually share them, because some have the community guidelines violation that you can't even look at it.
A lot of people I follow, they've had their entire accounts disabled because they've shared stuff like this. So the question that I want everyone to think about is whether or not there really is zero evidence that the election was interfered with. Because see, the media is hoping that you're not going to check, that you're just going to take their word for it, because they know that if someone hears something enough times, the repetition will literally rewire your subconscious beliefs, and you'll just accept it as fact, despite any evidence of the contrary. Okay. It's classic conditioning. It's psychology 101, and they know this and they've been using it. And so I want to just share like my experience with like kind of waking up and realizing, okay, something really did happen here. So I remember when the hearings were being held all over the country with Giuliani and Trump's team, and they were sharing their evidence on the stolen election. And the Pennsylvania hearing stands out the most to me because it lasted 14 hours and I listened to the whole damn thing. The reason was I was home with a colicky infant, breastfeeding, like couldn't like get up and do anything. So I plugged in my headphones and I listened to the whole freaking thing. And there were thousands of pieces of evidence. They had multiple witnesses, many of whom couldn't even come. There were so many, they couldn't even bring them all in. But they had all these witnesses that signed affidavits that went under oath, describing in detail the fraud that they witnessed. There were people that worked under both the Obama and Clinton administrations that testified to anomalies that were statistically impossible. Their words, statistically impossible. They could not happen. There were analysts that showed that spike of votes that all just happened to come at the exact same time at 2 a.m. and were all for Biden, none for Trump. Imagine that. And after that 14-hour hearing, I remember thinking, this is it. Like, they are going to overturn this election. Like, how can you deny all these thousands of pieces of evidence? But then nothing happened and nothing happened and nothing happened. And not only did nothing happen, but the mainstream media wasn't even there and they didn't talk about it. I remember going day after day after day after that hearing and seeing no one talking about what happened and no clips were being played other than the few independent journalists that were there, or C-SPAN, which I was watching it off of. So it was kind of like it never happened. And then when the Arizona hearing took place, again, I watched that and there was an abundance of evidence. And I want to point out that a lot of these witnesses were both Democrats and Republicans. It was not all Republicans. There were many lifelong Democrats who went there and pointed out the same discrepancies, and they came up with the same statistically impossible results. And after that hearing, I watched Katie Hobbs, who was Secretary of State at the time, go out front and tell the reporters that despite all that evidence that they just saw, they're not going to overturn the election results. And the reporters were asking her, okay, how can that be? We just sat through hours and hours of all of this evidence of fraud, clear evidence of fraud. And she said, well, yes, there was evidence, but in order for it to be considered fraud, they'd have to prove malicious intent. And there's just no way that you can prove that people intentionally committed fraud. So I'm sorry, I can't do anything about it. And the reporters, the crowd, everyone was stunned. And not long after that, Katie Hobbs won the election and she became governor. And despite the fact that she didn't campaign, she refused to debate her opponent, Carrie Lake. She had hardly any following. She didn't do any interviews, yet she just miraculously became governor not long after that. So that's when I knew for sure that the whole damn thing was rigged. And if that's not enough for you to realize what happened, I want to go over some cold, hard facts. So just use your common sense, okay? We have Obama that had 69 million votes and won 873 counties. He won 18 out of 19 bellwether counties. He won Florida, Ohio, and Iowa, as well as House seats. And if you think that's good, wait until you see Trump's numbers. Trump had 74 million votes, 2,497 counties, and also won 18 out of 19 bellwether counties. Also won Florida, Ohio, Iowa, and House seats. So that was the previous two presidents and what they won with. Now let's look at Biden. Biden had 81 million votes, more than any president in history. Yet he only won 477 counties. And I want to go over the numbers again. Obama had 873 counties. Trump had 2,497. And Biden only had 477 counties. Yet he had more votes than any president in history. That's weird. Well, you know what's even weirder? He only won 1 out of 19 bellwether counties. 1 of the 19. He also lost Florida, Ohio, Iowa, and House seats. Yet he got 81 million votes. The man that can't get 2 cars to show up to his speeches got more votes than anyone in history. Oh, and by the way, those votes all just happen to come in at 2 a.m. Right? Like, Tara, I'm sure you were like, I remember going to bed and thinking, Trump, it's in the bag. Trump is going to win. And waking up to the news that, oh no, all these votes came in at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's like, can anyone honestly say that this adds up? It's like knowing that the same damn thing happened in Brazil at the same damn time seems way too much of a coincidence, right?
Yeah, I had the exact same experience where I went to bed and I was like, okay, Trump has it in the bag. Like he was up so far ahead at that point. And then you wake up in the morning and I hear it's Biden and like my heart dropped. Like I was just like, there's no fucking way. There's no fucking way. And you just told everybody all the evidence. It's there. And I think one of the most critical things that people need to really pay attention to is we still have belief in our election system. It's fucking broken, and it's not broken by accident. This is all purposeful, setting us on this path to the totalitarian regime that the global elites want. Like, people should be demanding changes to the way we vote, to requirements for candidacy, like while we still have the ability to do that, because we're about to fucking lose it. And you were talking about Carrie Lake and what's her name, Katie Hobbs. And I remember going, Katie Hobbs didn't even do a single debate. She didn't campaign. She didn't do anything. Why are we allowing candidates to run who refuse to debate? And yes, I think this even applies to Trump because I know he didn't participate in the recent primary debates. It should be a condition across the board for any candidate that they have to debate. Why do we not have limits on campaign funding? We basically allow the elites and all these influential corporations to buy the votes. What does this do for the will of the people? Fucking nothing. And I know that realistically, we can't go back to the days of in-person paper voting because we're so far into the age of electronic everything, including voting. But I think it's incredibly dangerous. I think all voting should be done in person, with the exception of like deployed military, special conditions, and people with disabilities who quite literally can't go to the polls. But once we started with mail-in ballots, like we fucked up our voting system big time and we made it super easy for fraud to occur. And now we've got the left wanting to allow illegals to vote, drop the voting age to 16 so they can get all the votes for the indoctrinated youth and these millions and millions of migrants that have crossed our borders. And like, this is all by design. It's not about giving people rights. It's about getting rid of American independence. And we're allowing it to happen because as a nation, we've become so reliant on our government. We have given them too much power. And we used to be able to control that power with our vote. That's what the system is for. I mean, at least we did to an extent. There's always been government corruption, but not this in your face the way it is now. And we literally don't have any power anymore because it's been stolen. And we're so distracted in this country by nonsense. And we like this, what happened in Brazil, and I know this didn't just happen, it happened a while ago, but listening to this interview with Tucker and hearing some firsthand information that we did not get to see because it was all censored by our media, like, open your fucking eyes. What happened in other countries like Brazil is literally happening here. It is a crime in Brazil now to say that an election is stolen. It is a crime to speak out against the government. They're not just shadow banning people's social media like they do here. It's a literal crime. And you can bet that if the left wins the upcoming presidential election, free speech is going to become a crime here too. And keep in mind, this happened in Brazil with one election. The country literally went from a democracy to a dictatorship overnight. And you think that can't happen in America? Like, this is some scary shit that we literally aren't prepared for. Because if you take a look at Americans who were born and raised in the United States, never experienced anything like this in our lifetime. We've grown up with this, reportedly unbiased legal system that's not unbiased anymore, but we have never experienced a true dictatorship, true censorship, true control, with the exception of the January 6th insurrection. And technically, if you look at what happened during COVID with the lockdowns, like, that was a dictatorship, quite honestly. And what's crazy to me is that people seems to have forgotten that, like, our government orchestrated all that shit and we have never held them accountable for anything. We cannot depend on the government to hold itself accountable because they're not going to. That's the job of the people. That's why there's supposed to be checks and balances with our government. And we've let all that shit slide. So quite honestly, we're responsible for our own demise. And we're going to be paying for that really soon if the left stays in control. And I want to point out too that in addition to interviewing Bolsonaro, in that same podcast episode, Tucker interviewed a Brazilian journalist living in Florida named Paulo Figueiredo. And this guy can't go back to Brazil because he spoke out against the Lula government. They took away his passport. And during the interviews, he and Tucker were talking about how, as we talked about earlier, the US is complicit in getting rid of free speech in Brazil. They've shut down multiple journalists and podcasters who are now living in asylum in the United States because they spoke out against Lula and the government. These people are being accused of what they're calling crimes of opinion, crimes of misinformation, and there are quite literally Interpol arrest warrants out for dozens of these journalists from Brazil. And like I just said, if you think that cannot happen here, like, think again. January 6th will be nothing compared to what the left will be capable of if they gain control of this upcoming election. And I want to play a clip from this interview, and this is when Tucker was talking with the journalist.
So having lived through this, what do you think of the U.S. presidential election now in progress? You cover American politics, I should say, also.
Well, it's a moment of decision for the whole Western world, because I don't think there's a way Joe Biden can win fair and square. You can be president if 80% of the country think you're too old, and you're a large percentage of the country thinks he's mentally ill, maybe
he's senile.
Senile, like
Yeah.
whatever the Department of Justice says.
Yeah.
And you can't win a presidential race unless
You cheat.
it's not a fair and square election. So what I think is going on right now for the whole world is the whole world's watching. If people still matters in any way, Trump will be elected. If the establishment has all the power and democracy is dead in the Western world, and it was a good run. We had a good run for like a little over 200 years. That's very rare in the history. You study history, you know how rare that is. Then democracy is dead. And I can tell that because this is exactly what happened in Brazil. And what's going on more and more and more, and you see that, is that the powers are shifting from the people to the courts, what people call juristocracy, not a democracy anymore, which is a great thing for globalists, if you think about it. Well, let's say you want to change something in a democratic country, you have to pass a bill in Congress, and then the Senate needs to approve it, and the president needs to sanction it. And so if you're a billionaire, a progressive billionaire, and you have many here in the United States, and you want to change something in the society, let's say make the society more open, you have two options. Either you go through the very, very difficult democratic process.
Yes,
tedious. Yeah, it's very hard to control all that. And I think the founding fathers knew that, and that's why they made it this way. You can either do that, or you can, well, let's say you get 6 Supreme Court, just 5, and then you can, I don't know, make abortion legal all over the country. It has been done. It has been done before. So if you're a globalist, powerful elite, you can circumvent democracy and go straight to the judiciary. And that's exactly what happened in Brazil. And it can happen here. That's this most living. I've been living here for 10 years. I can tell. The reality that we're living in Brazil is not that far away from America, as you think. You guys think, oh my God, we've been a democracy for hundreds of years. And no. You think if you had like 6 Supreme Court justices that were progressive, appointed by Obama or Michelle Obama or who knows? You think your Supreme Court would be zealous about the Constitution? Really? If you told me 5 years ago that Brazil would be in this situation, I would say, get out of here. Nah, that's too much. They're not going to arrest a mainstream media journalist, take his passport. They've done it. It happened fast, very fast.
Well, you've wrecked my day.
Yes, I have to say, after listening to this podcast, it wrecked my day too, Tucker. But this is important shit that we need to be paying attention to if we have any hope of saving this country.
Yeah, well, and I would argue that it's already happening here in the US, because we just had journalist Stephen Baker get arrested by the FBI for being in the Capitol on January 6th. And Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, released more footage showing him just standing there documenting things. He was videoing it. He's a journalist. He was not participating in anything. He was standing off to the side videoing it. And now he's been arrested as well. So it's like, it's happening here. It's just that part of it isn't as documented. Like the media is not talking about it. But yeah, it's really scary.
Wait, that's the thing with January 6th is that, to me, is so incredibly scary, because people that weren't even doing anything are being arrested just for being in the vicinity.
Yep.
Like, you want to say that's not fucking dictatorship, totalitarian government?
Meanwhile, there's video footage, there's documentation of the FBI undercover as MAGA people, pushing people into the Capitol, opening doors. There's video documentation of these lefties pretending to be MAGA and starting shit. So it's like, it's just crazy. And this is years going on. There's people that have been sitting in prison this whole time. There was someone, wasn't it like the head of the Proud Boys or something? He wasn't even in DC and he got 20 years for January 6th. I mean, it's just like crazy bullshit. So the last thing I want to bring up about this interview is that, like, this is why we should really pay attention and care about what's happening in Brazil right now, because it is going to directly affect the US. So not only is Lula buddy with China and Biden, but as Brazil goes in the same direction that Venezuela went in, Brazilians are going to start to flee to the United States. And so he was saying that you had 8 million Venezuelans that left Venezuela to come to the US when they had that dictatorship happen. And he said Brazil has 8 times the amount of people, 8 times the amount. And if Biden gets reelected, that's going to be a really big problem.
Yeah. And on top of that, like, even though Lula may be buddy with Biden, that doesn't mean he's in support of American democracy, because he's not. And one of the things Bolsonaro said in that interview was, if we go to war, Brazil's going to partner with China against the United States.
Right. Well, and to be fair, Biden isn't in support of American democracy either.
Very true.
But, one other thing I just thought of, I can't believe I just thought of it now, but isn't Brazil the B in BRICS? Aren't they?
Yes.
Like, yeah. And they're the same size of the United States in terms of geography and population. So it's like, this is scary shit. Scary shit. And I'm just like dreading between now and November, because there's going to be all types of shenanigans going on. The left is pissed. They're mad about this Supreme Court ruling. They're going to go full force against Trump. And then you've got all of this election interference stuff that, to be honest, wasn't dealt with. The Republicans having control of the House could have made a lot of changes. As far as I know, they have not done anything with regards to our voting, our election system. I know states like Florida, I'm sure there's plenty of states that have kind of tightened up their rules around it, but nothing's been done at the federal level by the Republicans. So they're, part of the uniparty once again.
Yep.
So anyhow, that was we started out with good news about the Supreme Court. Then we scared the shit out of you. It's all about balance, right? It's balance.
Yep.
So I hope you enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll be back here on Friday. Thanks for tuning in. If you're sick of all the crazy shit going on in our country and you want to express your support and patriotism for the show, head on over to our Etsy store at UO Patriot Chicks and check out our new stickers. The link can also be found on our website. If you love the show and you want exclusive episodes, support the podcast and join the conversation by becoming a member of our Patreon community. We'll be posting weekly member-only podcast episodes and content that isn't available on the weekly podcast. Every Patreon member will also get a free Unapologetically Outspoken sticker and updates about our new sticker release before they're made public. And be sure to follow us on TikTok at Unapologetically Outspoken. And if you haven't done so already, please rate and review the podcast. The more you support us, the more people we can reach. So help us spread the word.